Mm. Mm. Zahraju za loadout na toho demomána. Pičo, ne. Loknout. Landuská už, jo. Scottish Resistance. To bude mrtka. No. Mám aspoň jednu zbraň, co není k zahození. Quick Bomb Punch. To není k zahození vůbec. A své sombrero, vole. Baby. Baby. Hmm. Spies around here. Thunderman, počkej, jo, tady. No. Doufám, že nebudu za pozoru. A dvě očky. Už se vlád.
We can all agree that Revenge of the Fallen went a little bit too far in a lot of places. However, from a visual effects perspective, this film holds a ridiculous amount of achievements, as at the time it had the biggest and most detailed CGI character that ILM had ever made, along with some of the longest renders ever done in history, in addition to having the biggest explosion ever on screen with actors, all whilst also having one of the highest budgets of the decade. And so when I hear this, my question is always, whilst all of this sounds great on paper, what does this actually mean in terms of crafting this film's visual effects? Well, basically, this entire film was just director Michael Bay's attempt to outdo the previous film at all costs. And so whilst you might think he achieved this through the film's massive characters or giant set pieces, it turns out that a lot of this success was actually much more due to the very small steps that the filmmakers took, and how all of these subtly combined together to make this film a ridiculous technical achievement that pushed filmmaking further than perhaps any other movie in the last few years. And so that's why, to explore these bigger achievements, we're going to break down the brilliance of each of these smaller steps and then use all of that to ask the big question, which is that, in pursuit of outdoing himself, did Michael Bay go too far with this film and start to lose track of what made the first one so special, therefore causing this film and its sequels to have all of these strange, kind of unnecessary little issues? So, to explore this and more, literally just fart for no reason as we dive into the visual effects of Revenge of the Fallen. So, before we get into how this film specifically went out of its way just to outdo its predecessor, to lay the groundwork for this, let's begin with how the general production of Revenge of the Fallen compared to Transformers 2007. Well, essentially, this film did everything we discussed in the last video. You know, practical effects, crazy stunts, ridiculous explosions. But this time around, like we said, they were now deliberately focused on expanding the previous film's more overt shortcomings. For example, whereas in Transformers 1, most of the robots' dialogue was done in these wide shots because their faces were just so difficult to animate, this time around they deliberately chose to have these many long close-up shots of the robots talking, because now, thanks to the lessons learned from the first film, they finally cracked this mechanical emoting process. And then a second example of this evolution was that, where in Transformers 1, because the robots were so physically demanding to craft, they only actually had a very small roster of just 14 robots in total. But in this film, they deliberately scaled that number all the way up to having 60 different robots, even though it would take about 30 weeks of total work to get each and every one ready. Or one final example of this evolution is that, whereas in Transformers 1, the robots actually had very little screen time because it was just so hard to keep them looking good, in this film they more than doubled that amount, and now also had them doing much more complicated movements and actions, to the point where the visual effects team actually said that the easiest shots to do in this film were the hardest ones to do in the previous. For now, for clarity, because I didn't want to retread on the same ground as my last video, I kind of just brushed over a lot of those achievements and made it sound like they just did them without any problems. But of course, each of them was a very ambitious goal that all came with their own problems. And so, to set the stage, here's Michael Bay explaining just how challenging this film's visual effects were.
My one freak out came and I called the producer at ILM and I said, Wayne, any director right now would want to blow their effing head off right now, okay? How is this movie ever going to effing get done? Please, I'm going to write you a check for $300,000 from my account. Hire more effing people. Anything, just anything to get me out of my misery.
And so yeah, beyond these specific advancements, what else did they begin to do to just deliberately flex on the previous film's achievements? Well, this brings us to perhaps the most underrated scene and most underrated character in this entire film, and that is the Reed Man scene. Because one of the goals of this film is to show more variation in the types of transformations that you see on screen. And the Decepticon Reed Man was absolutely the standout example of this, but it was also an absolute nightmare to get right. But first, if you wanted to keep your online data so safe that it would take an alien robot made of millions of little ball bearings to break in and steal it, then you should probably check out today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Because at this point, I'm just getting absolutely sick of the Zuck and the rest of his band of literal comic book villains who basically own the internet and are harvesting my data to do God knows what with it. And so that's why I've been using Surfshark VPN to keep me invisible whilst I'm online, because what it does is kind of scramble your online presence by moving your location to a country of your choice, therefore throwing off all of these meticulous techniques that these people are using to track you through the net. And by moving country like this, you can also get a whole heap of other benefits. For example, in countries like the UK, there's a lot of content that you just can't access on streaming services or other websites these days, but with Surfshark, within seconds, I was able to just hop to another country until I found one that does have what I was looking for. And then on top of this, you can also do the same thing for finding discounts as well. For example, by changing the country you're in with Surfshark, you can find potentially cheaper deals on things like flights, hotels, or even car rentals. So, to be both safer and save money online, go to surfshark.com/CGY or use the code CGY at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. They offer a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there is literally no risk. And with that, now back to the video and back to why Reedman was such a nightmare to do. Because the filmmakers wanted to have a scene where all of these metallic balls would merge to form a robot shape, which is a fantastic idea and made this shot into one of the most unique things in literally any movie ever. I mean, this was 2009, and I don't think I've seen a single thing since then that's topped this visually. But yeah, this has probably never been replicated because it's actually incredibly hard for visual effects artists to control this many objects at once. Because if you wanted to animate these thousands of balls individually by hand, one at a time, it would just take you literally forever to do so. And so to circumvent stuff like this, what visual effects artists typically do is let a computer simulation take over, as by using the simulation's maths and science and stuff, you can move a tremendous amount of information around by just feeding in a few simple commands like go here or flow there, making simulations fantastic for anything from crafting massive oceans to moving thousands of little balls around. But while simulations are great for doing things at a big scale, the issue is that they're just not great for accuracy, because by relying on maths to move everything around, you can't really get any direct fine control over anything, and it's just more like herding sheep where you can generally send them in one direction, but all in all each one will find its own way to the objective, which meant that their hands were pretty tied, because on one hand, if you wanted to sort of sheepdog these thousands of balls to the exact positions you need to form the exact robot shape you want at exactly the right time you need them to do so, then how ridiculously complicated does this mathematical algorithm have to be? But on the other hand, they also didn't have the years it would require to hand animate all of this. And so that's why, in the end, they actually did this entire scene backwards. Because what the team at Digital Domain realized was that the only position that they absolutely needed these balls to be in was that final shape of Reedman. And therefore, where the individual balls came from to actually get to this position was actually kind of irrelevant. And so this meant that if they started with these balls already in his shape and then just ran the entire simulation backwards so that he was actually getting deconstructed, this meant that when they then reversed that footage, they'd get the exact result they wanted, as now all of the reversed balls would look like they were flowing upwards to perfectly form Reedman's specific structure, which is just such a simple but genius way of bringing such a complex character to life. But what I really like about this effect is that it perfectly sets the stage for just how brilliant this film's visuals were and just how many little challenges they were going to have to overcome to make each moment possible. Which nicely brings me on to another massive flex that this film had over its predecessor that was also completely underrated, and that was these fully CGI scenes here. Because if the previous film just about managed to get the robots realistically integrated into live action, then this film took it a massive step further and decided to have its robots be realistically integrated into fully CGI environments. Because in doing this, Bay was able to take the world building of this franchise beyond the limits of Earth and begin to make it more about these incredible robots that came from outer space. But to be honest, I'm not about to start praising the story of this film too much, because that would just be impossible. And so let's just focus on the visual effects for now. Because, yeah, with Avatar coming out around the same time as this film, and basically being completely CGI, maybe Transformers fully CGI scenes aren't the most unique achievement, what I did find very impressive was the way that they managed to perfectly translate Michael Bay's style into these fully digital environments. As with Michael Bay coming from both an advertising background and also having this very hands-on approach where he likes to take control of the camera and such, it means that he has this very distinctive style as to how he frames the camera and as to the types of energy he likes to show on screen. Meaning that when it came to creating these specific camera movements digitally, this suddenly became a really difficult thing to do. Because as anyone who's ever tried to animate a CGI camera will tell you, it's just literally one of the hardest things to get looking right. As just translating the little things like the slight imperfections of the camera shaking as it moves around is just so challenging to mimic digitally. And so this was why the team at Industrial Light and Magic were actually very lucky that they could lean on this relatively new piece of technology that they've recently been working on, where they could give Michael Bay a low resolution version of the scene in addition to kind of a motion captured camera that would basically allow him to film within this fake CGI environment, meaning that Michael Bay could essentially walk around this virtual set in the real world and therefore frame and film everything just like he would in the real world, and therefore ensured that all of these digital scenes felt just like any other in the movie. And so what this basically was a very early version of that volume technology that they used on The Mandalorian with its massive CGI backgrounds that you can literally walk around, which is cool and everything, but what I really like about this is that it shows just how much of a team effort things like this are. Because sure, the visual effects team can make some incredibly wonderful CGI, and Michael Bay is clearly a very talented director who knows how to place a camera well, but without each other, this film is suddenly something much less special. And so by working together, the two of them can create this genuinely fantastic visual result that you only really can see in this franchise. Which does actually bring us to our third flex from the previous film, which was basically every single thing that happens during the forest fight sequence. And more importantly, the fact that Michael Bay wanted this to be an award-winning type of scene. As beyond having these fantastically integrated interactions between the fake CGI robots and the real-world forest, which we'll get to in just a minute, this scene also represents one of the two massive IMAX sequences in this film. And so now IMAX is one of those things that I've never really fully appreciated, but after learning about the ridiculous lengths that they went to do this sequence in IMAX, I suddenly feel quite bad about being too cheap to spend a few extra pounds on seeing this in its maximum quality. And if it ever comes back to the cinema, I'll definitely put in the effort to go see it again, because essentially what IMAX is a way larger screen that's way higher resolution, that therefore demands way more work from the visual effects team, because now it's basically 8 times bigger, and so all of their CGI has to be 8 times more detailed to hold up on it. And so not only did this mean that they had to make all of their robots to an incredibly high level of detail in order to look good, but also in his quest to flex, Michael Bay wanted this sequence to have the specific credit of being one of the first films to feature fully CGI characters integrated into fully live action IMAX footage. And it was this demand of fully live action IMAX footage that suddenly meant that all of the typical tricks that visual effects artists use to keep these robots looking good on camera were just completely off the table. As with these robots being fake, it means it's actually really difficult to set up a real-world camera to film them correctly. As, of course, on set you can't see them, and so you're kind of just imagining what the final result will look like. And so because it's so hard to get the framing of the actors and the invisible thing correct, what visual effects artists will do is come in and very subtly reorient and reposition the camera using digital techniques so that all of these fake things are just about framed correctly. But of course, if you're modifying the camera digitally, then it suddenly means you're no longer working on fully live action footage. And so in pursuit of his award, Michael Bay tried to limit this digital repositioning process as much as possible. And you know what? If you do watch this footage with this in mind, you can kind of tell that something's very slightly off about the framing throughout this sequence. Because yeah, in the end, they did still digitally rework the camera in a few places, but it must have just been very minimal, as the robots often still go out of frame, or it still feels like each shot is just about missing the key point of the action. But you know what, I kind of like this, because oftentimes the fights in Transformers Transformers are these very perfect and clean works of art, presumably because they've been run through Michael Bay's advertising brain, which wants to make things look as good as possible. But here, this fight feels so much more gritty and raw and real because it's just loose, and all of that really works in favour of the fight where the hero of the film dies. But yeah, this limitation basically just made things significantly harder for the already struggling visual effects team. Because on top of all of that, the even bigger problem was that computer hardware just literally wasn't ready to do this 8 times the level of detail thing. As back in 2009, things like the computing power or the 4K monitors that are needed to look at IMAX footage properly just really weren't a thing. And so to look at this footage, the visual effects team would literally have to work on one quadrant of the screen at a time, as there was basically no way of working on this footage in its full resolution. However, despite all of this, the forest fight is still the absolute peak of this film in literally all aspects. Well, aside from perhaps maybe this one shot here, because the ethos and the intention behind this shot may have actually been the beginning of the end for the entire Transformers franchise. But we'll get to that in just a minute. Because first, speaking of the sheer depth of the details in this film, the next massive flex that this film had over its predecessor was the ridiculous level of detail in the environment that these robots find themselves in. And by this, I don't just mean the sheer variety of locations in this film, but more so the ways that these robots interact with these environments. Because whilst the last film basically had these guys just standing on a static concrete surface, this time as these guys stomped around their new environments, the world would often respond to them, kicking up all sorts of CGI dirt and sand. And it's this interaction between the robot, the footage and the CGI environment that is also just an absolutely underrated addition, as not only does it make them look far more realistic, as now they're dynamically affecting the world they exist within, but also to make sure that all of this CGI lines up to the camera's movement. A visual effects technique called tracking needs to be meticulously applied, and so tracking isn't something that I've talked about too much on this channel, because typically it's not a super cool thing like making a transformer blow something up, but it is something that's both absolutely essential to getting them to work on screen and, more importantly, allowing them to interact with their environment. Because when you film something in real life, the camera is of course just moving all over the place, and so to get your CGI to line up with this movement and not slide around within the shot, the visual effects teams need to replicate this camera movement on the computer as well. Otherwise the CGI will never line up with the footage and it's going to be really obvious that it's fake. And so you achieve this replicated movement of the camera by tracking the movement of the footage. And if you get lucky, this can be a nice automated process where the computer just scans the footage and figures out all of this little movement detail for you. But on the complicated shots like those we see all throughout Transformers 2, where the camera is always sweeping around rapidly and shaking all over the place, this suddenly becomes very hard for the computer to automatically understand, as there's just too much going on for it. And so at the end of the day, the only way you could track a shot like this would be through just tedious manual effort. And so the people who do this are genuinely some of the unsung heroes of the visual effects industry, because without getting this absolutely perfect track of the footage, there's no way you could integrate all of this subtle detail around these robots. And so there'd just be no way we'd ever have gotten such a dynamic and realistic looking film as this, if not for their insane efforts. And you know what? Speaking of unsung heroes, this brings me to another unsung hero of not just the entire visual effects industry, but also this film in particular, and that is the rotoscope artists. Because typically when you look at the behind the scenes of a film, whenever they're going to have an actor in the foreground and lots of CGI in the background, the filmmakers tend to put up a green or a blue screen, as this makes it much easier to insert the CGI behind them. But if you look at the behind the scenes of this film, there's basically never any blue screens, with there being maybe 2 throughout the entire film. And that's because, again, Michael Bay likes to shoot things for real, and so deliberately likes to work with the environment surrounding his actors to create this dynamic and cinematic framing, which is something that you just can't really do when all you're looking at is some green background. And so whilst this is great, it also means that without green screens, to insert any CGI behind these actors, each of them had to be constantly rotoscoped, which is a process where the actors have to be digitally drawn around by hand on a frame-by-frame basis as they move to separate them out from the rest of the image. And as you can imagine, this is just an absurdly time-consuming process, because any little movement like their fingers or even their hair twitching in the wind, needs to be drawn around. And so it can take many artists an incredibly long time to do this for an entire movie. But it just paid off so much that they did do this. Because even today, there's not many other films out there that have this fantastic mix of actors, amazing CGI, and just fantastic cinematography with the environment around them. And so between these real-world locations and the perfectly tracked interaction between the locations and the robots, you suddenly get a film that really feels ridiculously real, because at this point, so much of it basically is. And so now, with all of this in mind, how did these smaller steps combine together to form this film's major visual achievements, such as the big lad himself, Devastator? Well, strangely enough, after everything we've discussed, in terms of actual unique differences or challenges, I don't actually have that much to discuss about Devastator, as firstly, the YouTuber Theorymus recently did a massive breakdown on him, and I don't want to retread on too much ground, but also, aside from all of those insane statistics that you hear about him, like he was 6 Optimus Primes worth of detail chucked together, or that he actually blew up someone's computer when he was loaded onto it, at its core, Devastator is just a much bigger manifestation of everything we've discussed in this video up until this point. You know, so he's seen as an IMAX, so already he needs 8 times the detail of the rest of the film's characters, and then on top of that he's got these computer simulations that were massive and very difficult to control, and then on top of that he's perfectly interacting with the world around him, kicking up all of the sand and such, and then on top of that, all of this is being tied together by those unsung heroes we mentioned who are doing all of the meticulous frame-by-frame tasks like rotoscoping. But it's just that now, unlike the rest of the film, all of this is even harder because it's being done on a significantly bigger scale. And so to have any chance of doing this, all of those little tricks we mentioned throughout this video, like the artist having to work on one quadrant of the screen at a time, had to be massively depended upon to make any of this possible. And so yeah, all of the praise this character gets is absolutely valid, and he genuinely does belong in like the visual effects Hall of Fame as one of the greatest CGI characters of all time. But now, with all of these pushed limits in mind, this now leads me to ask the big question that we've been building to, which is, did Michael Bay take all of this too far? As whilst the previous film was limited by its technology, and therefore everything in it was kind of brilliantly crafted around those limits, the freedom that was enabled by the technological advancements in this film meant Michael Bay was no longer held back, and he was essentially unleashed to do whatever he wanted. And so whilst Michael Bay clearly knows how to do action, clearly knows how to get locations you'd never think possible, and also has this fantastic relationship with things like the US military, which actually lets him make some pretty flipping good propaganda. You know, I wonder why this film ends with a big fight in the Middle East. And in fact, I'm not even joking, in the behind the scenes, they literally admit to this being propaganda.
Really, it's a perfect relationship. Michael Bay makes movies the way Michael Bay makes movies, which are big equipment, big action. The military is probably the best organization to provide that kind of support. And on the flip side, Transformers is targeted at a younger audience, which is right in line with who we like to talk to when it comes to recruiting.
But yeah, my point is that, despite all of his talents, it was also Michael Bay's idea to make these robots far, or his idea to have Wheelie hump Megan Fox's leg, as in the original script he was going to be fun and sweet like his cartoon counterpart, but that then later on got changed by Bay to make him, and I quote, schizo. And then furthermore, it was also his idea to do the enemy scrotum thing, or to increase the violence significantly and essentially turn nice dad father figure Optimus Prime into a psychopath, to the point where it was Bay's only requirement for the forest fight that Optimus Prime should rip a guy's face in half. And then it was also Michael Bay's choice to make the characters drool and sort of bleed and just generally increase the violence level and push that PG-13 rating to its limit. And then finally it was also his choice to make the transformations faster and more kinetic, which, whilst looking really cool and probably making things a lot easier to animate, also meant that they kind of lost that beautiful majesty they had in the previous film where they transformed so slowly and beautifully. And so while some of these choices may be subjectively quite good, a lot of the time I do find it quite hard to say whether they were definitively good choices or not. But then, in opposed to all of that, it is also quite interesting to consider just how highly people such as the visual effects team consistently spoke about not only how good Michael Bay's sort of management style is, but also his eye for CGI. As for example, whilst visual effects artists typically aim to make the most reality-based results possible, Michael Bay actually consistently pushed the team to break with this idea in a lot of places, and in the end actually turned out to be really right to do so, as the visual effects team wanted to keep things like scientifically correct motion blur on their robots, which, you know, is that thing where they use maths and science and stuff to figure out how blurry the robot should look on camera based on the speed they're moving around, which obviously makes sense to do because everything that moves on camera has to a degree some sense of blur to it, for example. But with the robots being so physically detailed, it meant that when blurred by motion, they would kind of just turn into visual mush on screen, even if this blur is what should be scientifically, mathematically correct. But with Michael Bay coming from this advertising background, he not only has a way of making things look impossibly real and almost ethereal, but he also believes that the audience should be able to see what they've paid for, and therefore he deliberately pushed for these robots to always be very sharp on screen, oftentimes sharper than the actual footage itself, even though this went completely against the rules of making good-looking CGI. But for some reason, this really worked for this film, because there's something just so magically captivating about those visuals, as the whole thing really does have this clean, perfect, advert-like aesthetic that, again, you just don't get anywhere else. And so yeah, to summarize all of this, regardless of things like the writer's strike and its effect on this movie's narrative, I think this film was a real sign of things to come with this franchise. That each of these movies are going to be these incredible technical demonstrations that massively push the limits of filmmaking, but that at the same time, you are also going to have to deal with this strange Michael Bay energy at each step of the journey, with very varying results as to whether this energy is a good idea or not. However, we should also consider that if you look at the stuff that Bay is no longer involved in, like that big battle at the end of Rise of the Beasts, where you essentially just have loads of CGI hitting each other in some big CGI open field, versus the ridiculous efforts here and just how good they look, I think it's really hard to say that Michael Bay wasn't at least getting some things right. But I guess we'll get to those films when we get there. Thank you for watching, everyone, and if you like this video, I guarantee you'll also enjoy our film podcast. So far, we've covered a bunch of different Transformers films, and each week it just gets better and better. And the one we did on Revenge of the Fallen is absolutely my favourite one so far. So please click the link below if you want to hear some upbeat film discussions. And speaking of Transformers coverage, if you also click the other link below, I also guarantee you'll enjoy our Patreon, where for less than $2 a month, you can get access to a bunch of exclusive videos and much, much more. Every little bit of support means the absolute world and goes straight back into the videos. So thank you to my Patreon subs. So that is Darth Gator, Modern Adventurer, Cthulhu88, Chris Colleen, Archer Green, Janal Van Menzel, and then an even bigger thank you to Lime, Rye Jones, and Nathan Kelschat, and then just an absolutely massive thank you to Darren Birmingham.
2007's Transformers might be the most cinematic movie ever made, all whilst also having some of the most photorealistic CGI I've ever seen. But how? Well, this film is just a masterclass in applying your visual effects so perfectly that you literally cannot tell where the CGI ends and the practical effects begins, and then using that to create trailer shot after trailer shot after trailer shot. However, at the same time, because of this insanely high bar for quality, it also got to the point where each Transformer in the Transformers film sadly barely had any screen time or character development whatsoever. And so that's why in this video, we're going to break down all of this to explore what exactly made this film look so good and what the narrative consequences of this were, but also why this lack of character development may have not necessarily have been a completely bad thing for the overall aims of this film. So, to explore all of this and more, load up your eBay page and lose your trousers as we dive into the impossibly realistic effects of Transformers. So what was it that made this film's CGI stand out from every other film out there? Well, usually I try to open these videos with the director's goals. You know, set the stage as to why the director needed a certain look and feel for the film and how they then had the visual effects crafted around achieving that goal. But with Michael Bay, this film's director, it seems he only really had one overarching piece of criteria, and that was purely that this film's visual effects had to be as absolutely cool as they could possibly be, because he didn't want to just make a kid's toy film. This was basically going to be the first giant robot robot film that wasn't a bunch of guys in rubber costumes. And so he wanted to take full advantage of the freedom that CGI could give him and make it so that these robots were essentially giant ninja warriors who could jump, flip, dive, and basically do anything he wanted, so that every single aspect of this film could be turned up to 11. And you know what? It was this constant pursuit of cool that at the end of the day was kind of what made this entire film's visuals work so well. Because in pretty much every single aspect of this film, Bay had a very specific vision of exactly what he was after and had the visual effects pushed to the absolute limit in order to manifest this vision. And we can see this really interestingly brought to life in the film's most important CG element when it came to realism, and that was the reflective metal coatings across these giant robots. Because, spoiler alert, as good as this film is, it is also just one big massive advert for both cars and the US military. And therefore, because of this, all of the vehicles in this film had to look as absolutely ridiculously perfect and cool as they possibly could. Meaning that, on set, things like these cars were getting constantly buffed and wiped down and cleaned to give them this absurdly cinematic but also absurdly reflective finish, which, at the end of the day, turned out to be both the major blessing but also a major curse to the poor visual effects artists who were tasked with selling the illusion that these robots were transforming out of and therefore genuinely formed from pieces of these super reflective cars. But why? Well, despite that nowadays, even things like video games can calculate those mirror-like reflections in real time, back in 2007, the technology used to calculate these reflections, ray tracing, was absurdly slow. So slow, in fact, that there was literally no way that the Transformers team could use this for an entire film. And so, I mean, they could use it tactically for little bits of the robots here and there, but overall, they would just have no choice but to depend on this much older scanline rendering technique, one which would be able to calculate the reflections of the environments around the robots, but not the reflections of other CGI objects in the scene, like the reflections of the other robots around them, which is just a major problem when your cars are this reflective. And so, faced with just an impossible hardware limitation, this is where the artists realized that the only way to make any of this work would be to basically just cheat a lot of this detail, and rather than depend on things like the slow ray tracing to calculate this realism for them, they decided that they would instead leverage basically every single trick in the book, with the hope that if they were all done absolutely correctly, that they would just about come together to manage to sell the illusion that these guys were genuinely photorealistic. So, what did they do, and how did they manage to just about squeeze realism out of these characters? Well, one example of this was to scan little bits of their real-world cars and then build their CGI characters out of these, so that the digital robot could inherit a lot of subtle detail from their real-world counterpart and therefore look significantly more realistic. Or another technique was that they realized that they could just add in a lot of these streaky car paint reflections after the fact by hand, sort of video Photoshop style, painting and layering them in, and therefore save them a lot of time because the computer doesn't have to spend hours calculating this for them. But of all of their tricks, by far the most important and the most effective of all of them was that they came in and purposefully messed up the surfaces of these robots with thousands of layers of battle damage, grease, grime, dirt and oil spills, and basically aged them from perfectly reflective cars into robots that look like they've genuinely been fighting a war for thousands of years. And it was this that truly worked wonders for their realism. Because here's the thing, despite their cars being ridiculously reflective, you don't want your CGI to be anywhere near that perfectly reflective. Because if it is, then it's just going to look really unrealistic, as in reality, there's absolutely no way any of these robots would ever stay this clean. And so them being so would just be an immediate giveaway that they were fake. And so by adding in things like these dirty, scanned, video Photoshop metals over their already ridiculously well crafted and heavily detailed 3D models, the visual effects artists ended up with these incredibly realistic looking robots, as now the artists could actually go as far as using this dirt to actually art direct the robots on a shot by shot basis and therefore use it to perfectly optimize their realism for that shot. So an example of this would be in a close-up shot where the robots need much more detail, the visual effects artist would be able to come in and paint extra layers of scratches and dirt and grime to increase their perceived detail without going in and physically modelling more across their already ridiculously detailed surfaces. Or another example of this would be in a bright, shiny, reflective shot where they'd need lots and lots of ray tracing. They could now come in and make the robots look so messy and dirty that they would completely eliminate the need for ray tracing anyway. And so basically, leveraging techniques like this dirt allowed them to bring the core part of these robots' bodies, the actual metal materials, to life in a way which could look as absolutely realistic as possible. And you know what? They did such a good job of balancing this mirror-like reflectivity against this messiness that I must have seen this film literally hundreds of times, and I never once noticed that there's actually this major difference between the messiness of the robots and the cleanliness of the cars they transform out of. However, despite just how good all of this was, the key word to all of this was that they had to do it on a shot-by-shot basis. Because with them using these tricks to generate a lot of this realism, it meant that every single time the lighting or the camera position changed, the poor visual effects artists would have to create fresh layers of dirt or meticulously manipulate all of their scanned materials to get these robots to now look good under these new conditions. And so despite saving them a lot of time on things like computer calculations, basically making this entire film possible, this trickery approach was also a double-edged sword, because now it meant every single shot required so much manual labor to get it working. And so this double-edged sword and its consequences is actually something we're going to be observing throughout all of Transformers' visual effects, because these consequences had a major impact on both the quality but also the quantity of the robots we saw on screen. And so with this in mind, this brings us nicely along to our next section, because nailing the lighting and the reflections was only really one part of this coolness puzzle which contributed to their realism. Because like we said, this film is one of those really special ones where the CGI looks so good that you literally cannot tell where the practical effects stop. And so this kind of leads you to ask, what in this film was actually practical, and how much did that contribute to the end result looking so good? But before we get to that, speaking of how brilliant this film looks, this brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant. Because for years I've heard that you can easily teach yourself programming from home, but literally every single time I've tried doing so, I've ended up falling asleep in front of some boring YouTube tutorial. But that was until I started using Brilliant and its thousands of fun, quick, interactive lessons. Because thanks to its daily approach, I've actually been able to build the habit of learning and have fun whilst doing so, all by doing just a little bit every day. And therefore, I've finally gotten myself to the point where I can actually make a few programs that help out in my daily life. And so, given that I've finally been making progress with programming, I've also now started to have my eye on the other courses that Brilliant offers, namely their How Large Language Models Work course, which lets you get hands-on with real language models to explore how they build their vocabulary, choose their next word, or the importance of training them and how the data you train them on affects how they write, and just basically, all in all, understand how the future of human technology is actually going to work. So I highly recommend checking out everything Brilliant has to offer, from mathematics to data analysis, for 30 days for free by clicking on my link in the description and going to brilliant.org/CGY, where you can also get a whopping 20% off an annual premium subscription. So click the link below to finally start working towards those goals you've been putting off for literally years with Brilliant. And with that, thank you to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and now back to the video. And back to what in this film was actually practical. Well, with it being a Michael Bay film, you'd assume that most of these practical effects would just be the explosions. But as you dig deeper into this movie, it turns out that basically everything that wasn't some kind of giant robot pretty much had some kind of practical element to it. So for example, when main character Sam was on the hood of the car getting interrogated, they really did smash up the car around him, or they really did pull apart this moving bus to create this big fiery explosion, or they really did fly a miniature Megatron through a building to get all of this complex, subtle destruction details. And so they technically didn't have to do any of this, and they could have just gone very hard on the CGI angle, but the fact that they did contributes a hell of a lot to the realism of these robots, as even though they're not actually there, your actors can really easily portray the feeling that they are. Because if you do watch the behind the scenes of this film, you can tell they are actually quite reasonably really scared to do a lot of this stuff. And so all of those screams you see as they run away from an explosion are completely real, and this massively contributes to the quality of this film's visual effects. Because with with this fear being real, it really does make it feel like there's this giant alien robot looming over them asking about their eBay account. And it does so in a way that I think even the world's best actor couldn't pretend to do so. However, from a visual effects perspective, these practical effects also do so much more than just increasing the tension, because all of this dirt and dust and debris was actually a little bit of a secret weapon when it came to the Transformers visual effects team. Because to quote and very slightly paraphrase Transformers CG supervisor Himmler Koch, if we had to destroy everything that Michael Bay destroyed digitally, then it would have been horrible. And he said this not only because if all of this destruction was CGI along with the robots being CGI, then it probably would have just been way too much fake stuff on screen, but also because all of this chaos could actually be leveraged to massively increase the robots' realism, as by tucking them away inside of this smoke, it makes it so that they're both so much harder for the audience to see and therefore to determine faults with, but also so that they're now essentially covered with this transparent sheet of genuine reality, which in turn injects all of this subtle real-world detail into the appearances of these characters that you could just never get otherwise, and it truly grounds these characters into the world around them. But as amazing as this was, there is a reason why not many other films choose to use this secret weapon that often, and that is that because of all of this depth and detail in the smoke, integrating CGI into smoke is insanely hard to do because there's just so much subtlety to account for, and so to get them to look good, it ends up being this massive collaborative effort between a lot of different artists. And so again, this is another example of that cool factor coming into play to both make these guys look great, but also hindering how much they can be on screen, as by having all of these practical effects, it just looks amazing and awesome because they're really there with all of these explosions. But it also means that, much like with the lighting, integrating these guys into a shot was a slow, shot-by-shot process that had to account for all of these tiny little things. Again, the consequences of which we'll properly get into later in the video. But first, speaking of these guys being time expensive to have on screen, something else I wanted to quickly cover was that usually I would make a comment about how these guys should have actually been cheaper and easier to get looking good than most other CGI characters because they are what is called a hard-bodied character, which means unlike people like Tarkin or Clue or Davy Jones, they don't have any CGI skin which is unpredictably stretchy or a nightmare to calculate the diffusion of light through, but instead they have these nice solid edges and shapes that are much easier to get right because the shape of them remains consistent the entire time. And I mean, yeah, actually having them be made out of predictable shapes like this is a big factor that help make them look great. And so this is also one of the many reasons why other CG robots like Chappie or those in the creator tend to look great as well. But it also turns out that when trying to meet the very specific demands of this film, this stiff, hard-bodied approach to these robots also came along with its own very unique nightmare. Because Michael Bay wanted the Transformers to be these sympathetic characters that audiences could connect with on an emotional level. And so he didn't want to hide their faces away behind masks or flashing lights, but instead for them to have the same full, complex emotional range that any humanoid character could have. But with their faces being hard and unable to stretch, then there was no way you could map human emotions to them in the same way that you would with, say, someone like Davy Jones. And so to have any chance of making these guys at all sympathetic looking, the visual effects artist had to sit down and go all the way back to the drawing board in order to find a way to desperately try and squeeze some emotion out of these firm metallic faces. And after a lot of trial and error, they eventually settled on the solution of these segmented faces, where these different layers of metal plates could overlap and slide across one another in a way that would give the animators enough freedom that they could actually start to mirror real-world human emotion on these guys. However, whilst in theory this sounds like an easy and great solution, in execution this was anything but simple. Because the truth of human emotion is in those absolute subtleties, you know, like the specific way in which skin wrinkles when you squint your eyes and what that tells you about how that person is feeling. And so to transfer these tiny little specific details across to metal, the visual effects artist realized that these robots would now need an absurd amount of actual physical detail detail and individual pieces in order to generate the movement required to do this, to the point where even a single eye of a robot could now have more than 50 individual components that the animators would have to meticulously control in order to pull emotions out of it. And so whilst at the end of the day this process was absolutely worth it because now we could emotionally connect with them, it also made it so that each and every performance took a significant amount of time and handcrafted energy to pull it off. And so stuff like this is probably a very large factor as to why characters like Bumblebee didn't talk, or as to why the characters who did talk generally had very few lines, or why there were actually very few close-ups of the characters actually emoting, and instead all of the conversations were done in these wide shots. Because basically each and every time you had to do one of these shots, it was just a major drain on production resources to get it to even remotely work. And so we can sort of start to see a bit of a pattern emerging here, that at almost every stage of making these guys, there was such a bar of quality that the film had to maintain, and this made them look fantastic, but also in turn resulted in much less screen time for these robots. But we'll circle back to this and bring it all together in just a second, because speaking of this tremendous amount of detail, one other point that I wanted to quickly cover was that it wasn't just limited to the characters' faces, but in fact all of these robots were crafted down to the tiniest, most meticulous of details. Because when it came to having the Transformers on screen, they didn't want a single frame of these robots to not be packed with movie magic or dripping with badass moments. And so basically every single transformation in this film had to be this mind-blowing moment where the robots folded apart like these three-dimensional Rubik's Cube jigsaw puzzles to reveal all of these complex internal details, which is a great idea on paper and looks visually awesome, but also meant that in order to animate all of the tiny internal details needed to make this possible, the visual effects artists behind this film basically had to completely break the entire way that computer animation operates just to have a hope of getting this to remotely function. So what do I mean by this, and how did these transformations actually work? Well, your typical transformation shot would start with one of the robots in one of their extreme forms, so usually the robot form, and then the first thing the visual effects artist would do would be to animate that robot down to fit into their car mode. But because the robot forms were not actually a one-to-one match of the vehicle, all this would actually look like is a weirdly folded up robot and absolutely nothing like a truck. And so the real trick would be getting all of those internal parts and maneuvering them outwards to match up with that truck shape. And this is what made things get ridiculously complicated, because the way you would typically animate is with this thing called a rig. And so this is basically like this really cool skeleton system where you can link the character up to these bones that pivot around a single point, which makes them brilliant for most forms of animation like fighting or talking, or even that general process of folding the robot up into a car. However, if you're trying to move these insanely complex internal details of a character, then that's going to have to be a ridiculously complicated skeleton rig thing, because in order to move that much detail, each one of these tiny little pieces is going to need its own individual bones and points to pivot around, which just sooner or later is going to become an absolute nightmare to manage. And so this is why, for this movie, the visual effects artist came up with this insanely simple but also insanely brilliant solution to this. Because what they did was build this dynamic rigging system here, where they could just grab any part of these characters and then immediately set a custom pivot point for them completely on the fly, which essentially turned these guys into like animatable computer Lego, basically. Because now the visual effects artists were able to completely pull apart any bit of these robots and then move that bit in any direction they wanted, therefore finally enabling the artist to create that seamless deconstruction of robot into car, as now all of those internal parts could now slide in any direction and genuinely fulfill the illusion of the two of them blending together, and allow them to do so in a way that looked as cinematic as possible. Because with the freedom of this dynamic rigging method, each transformation could be handcrafted to be this performance that looked truly amazing on camera, but that actually had a lot of cheating going on just off screen, all of which truly allowed that movie magic feeling to come bleeding in. But again, it had to be handcrafted, and it's that handcrafted nature that's slowing everything down, because now even simple things like the robot switching weapons had to go through this same complex transformation process, all of which puts up another major roadblock on these guys' screen time, which we'll get to just after this last section. Because there was one final part to this coolness pie that made Transformers look so good. That was the these fantastic fight animations. Because like we mentioned earlier, Michael Bay didn't want the Transformers to be these sluggish brawlers, but instead for them to fight like fast-paced ninjas. And so to choreograph this, Bay got his stunt team and had them plan out all of these rapid fights for the animators to then go and replicate on the Transformers themselves, having the stunt actors do these quick moves inspired by the classic martial arts movies of the past. But this is, of course, where reality smacks visual effects right in the face, because a Transformer is like 30 times bigger than a tiny little human stuntman. And so transferring the speeds of a little lightweight martial arts ninja stuntman onto these hulking giant behemoth robots is basically physically impossible. And so that's why usually giant stuff in movies are portrayed as these sluggish, lumbering characters, because that's the only real physically correct way something like that would move. But if Michael Bay wants super cool ninja fights, then Michael Bay gets super cool ninja fights. And so the poor animation team really had to go all out to pull this off, to the point where, once again, they had to turn to cheating and little tricks to get this to work. So, for example, they knew that the closer to the camera that the robots got, then the more quickly and ninja-like they could get away with them being able to move. As the less and less of the robot's full body that the audience could actually see, then the less and less problems with their speed-to-weight ratio that the audience is able to pick holes in. And so I'm assuming that that's why so much of this film is actually shot with these guys getting really close to the camera, as I always thought that this was just some stylized choice to give it this grounded, realistic wartime feeling. But I guess this was also a very clever and deliberate choice to give the animators the opportunity to cheat the fast-paced animation like this, and allow them to create these brilliant scenes by giving these robots essentially impossible speeds. But again, this close proximity of the robots to the camera then becomes its own balancing act, because of course, the closer they are to the camera, then the more physical detail across their surface that the audience is able to see. And so, because of this, more effort and more man hours have to subsequently go into crafting and managing the insane amounts of tiny little scratches and dents and details needed to keep them looking realistic when the camera is this close to them. And so this really does now bring us to the core of all of this. That, yeah, these guys did have a pretty limited overall presence in this movie, and people who complain about this having a negative influence on the overall concept of this being a Transformers film are probably right. However, at the same time, wanting to change this, at least for this first movie, is essentially wanting to have your cake and eat it, because people will also complain when CGI looks bad. But as we've explored in this video, making insanely good CGI like Transformers had is ridiculously hard. And so if you want good looking CGI, then it's probably going to have to be limited in some form or another in order to keep that quality consistent. And so we as audiences are left with a choice as to what we want. And I think Transformers made the right choice in
bloody cart's not moving! That demo's a bloody spy! The cart's moving back! The car's not moving, lads! The car's not moving!
Garbage na Var det då har de sett sargen där i?
The car!
Mám hrozně malej damage output. Nedělám damage si duši. It's not moving now.
The bloody cart's not moving!
Mission ends in 60 seconds.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
Mission ends in 30 seconds. Mission ends in 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Overtime. You failed.
La 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 la. La 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 la. Reset.
Time has been added.
Cheers, mate! Stand on the bloody point, you half-wit!
The control point has been contested.
Medic!
We have secured the control
Flipping
point.
point!
Alert. Our control point is being captured. We have lost the control point.
The car's not moving, lads.
Prioritizing quality over quantity, because this film does such a good job of utilizing its limited CGI. Because with that overarching cool factor guiding its appearance, not a single frame of this film is wasted, and basically every single shot is this cinematic, memorable moment that is becoming harder and harder to find these days. Well, except for maybe this scene. And so CGI often gets a lot of criticism for not being a real art form, but I really think Transformers is the film that destroys this statement, because you can really see that it's leveraging this CGI in a genuinely special way to do something really different, and the efforts of all of these artists really do translate through onto the screen. And I guess the only criticism I can leverage of this film's visual effects and this overarching coolness factor is that now that the production, visual effects, robots groundwork is laid by this film, the future films didn't really expand on that to give the robots any more character development, but instead just went even harder in this coolness direction, which again has its pros and cons, but I guess we'll get to that when we cover those films. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you like this video and you want to see more, please feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell as well so that you never miss an upload. And I just want to give a massive thank you to the support of all of my Patreon subs for helping keep the quality of these videos as high as possible. Without your help, these videos would be significantly harder to put together, so genuinely thank you so much again. And I also want to thank both Brooks Hargreaves for providing the footage of this lovely Transformers presentation, and particularly also thank Theorymus for providing me with and massively supporting me with basically all of the behind the scenes footage used in this video. Without him archiving most of this stuff, it surely would have been just lost to time. So if you like this movie, I highly recommend checking out his channel for some fantastic and deep and thorough coverage of the Bayformers lore. And so thank you again, and the links to both of these channels can be found below. The visual effects of 2004's Dr. Octopus struck the perfect blend of both CGI and practical effects, because his murderous tentacle appendages were actually brought to life via this highly unorthodox combination of these genuine practical puppets, which were then masterfully enhanced with CGI overlays to achieve this balance of both consistent visual quality and impossible comic book moments that very few superhero films have ever managed to live up to since. And this was all because director Sam Raimi wanted to do something a little different with Doc Ock, and not just have him be another generic villain of the week like we so often get nowadays, but instead use him as this avenue to tell a timeless and universal story. So that's why in this video we're going to cover how exactly they even did these arms practically, how this made the entire story of Spider-Man 2 even remotely possible, and why, after almost 20 years of VFX development between Spider-Man 2 and Doc Ock's return in No Way Home, do his arms weapons look about the same, if not maybe worse. So arm yourself as we use all of this to answer why the visual effects of Dr. Octopus have aged so flawlessly. So why were these arms done practically? I mean, 2004's CGI wasn't amazing or anything, but it probably could have done this for an entire film. Well, from both a character and a visual effects perspective, the thing that made Doc Ock stand out from any other villains is that he's not just one singular character. Because at the core of Otto's story, and the thing that makes him such a fantastic villain, is this tragic tale of corruption that comes along with him, where he initially sets out to give free energy to the entire world, but along the way gets warped and twisted by these 4 mechanical arms that drag him down into a life of crime. And so, to bring this whole corruption story to life, they not only needed performances from Dr. Octopus's actor, Alfred Molina, but also these.
What am I hearing right now? Probably you heard the music connected to the follow. Or maybe the video I had on behind, but nobody was here, so it was the video. Well, I don't actually know what's the video, I'm just listening to it because why not? How are you?
Alert. Our control point is being captured.
Lego Pokemon 666. Okay.
Alert. The control point is being captured.
Four mechanical arms that were fused to his spine needed to be manifested as their own complete characters as well, essentially taking on the role of Alfred Molina's co-stars and having to perform alongside him by emoting everything from anger to submission to manipulation, because for them to be these corruptors of Otto, they had to be fully personified as their own separate entities so that they could independently slither around Otto's back and whisper their poison directly into his mind. And so if you look at this objectively, objectively, this is a rather tall order to fill, both narratively and visually on screen, when you consider that half of Dr. Octopus's character is coming from these completely fake things, because these things can't even talk. So this whole corruption narrative would have to be manifested completely via how they physically moved on the screen and how they interacted with Otto. And so this is where the use of practical puppets became this incredibly good decision. Because typically, if you're going to make a fake character out of CGI and you wanted them to feel authentic, then what you generally do is record a real actor in one of those really unflattering grey suits that digitally capture their motion and performance for you, because this way a talented actor can lend their skills to you and give you this really realistic baseline for your CGI character's performance. But obviously, in real life, there's nothing that you could use as a motion capture stand-in for any of these giant robot tentacles. And so without this, poor old Alfred Molina would just have to imagine the CGI he'd be acting against. And this would have made it so much harder for him to craft this genuinely powerful, emotive performance that makes up like half the soul of this film, because there'd just be nothing for him to work with. And so by choosing to have these genuine prop arms there on set, not only did it mean a massive reduction in the amount of VFX work this film needed, but it also meant that Alfred Molina could build this genuine on-screen relationship with them in the exact same way that actors typically would do, by improvising and bouncing off one another, whilst also building up this whole visual language between each other to create those really nice, natural character moments in a way that would be genuinely impossible to do if he was just guessing what digital thing would be added in there later. Because on top of all of this, having those arms there for real also meant that Sam Raimi was able to direct these arms as if they were a real actor as well, and refine down all of those little visual cues that actors and filmmakers tend to work on, like on-screen power dynamics or who is framed in what way to subtly tell which part of the story, and basically with this, really take control over just how this deteriorating relationship between Otto and his arms was portrayed on screen, so that between him, Alfred Molina, and the efforts of a lot of others on set, who we'll get to in just a second, he would be able to tell the exact story he wanted. However, as fantastic as this all sounds, I don't want to give the impression that people who choose to use CGI are just lazy, and that practical effects are this amazing, perfect thing. Because this choice to use real arms wasn't just a simple one that came with no strings attached. You get it? Strings, because they're puppets?
Shut up, Dallas, you're not that funny.
Because to do this practically, they had to strap 4 genuine giant prop arms to Alfred Molina's back using this custom harness thing here, and then up to 16 puppeteers on the set would have to move them around and perfectly control them to feel like they were this mix of both a natural extension of Otto that was directly wired into his brain, and at the same time also feel like they have this dangerous level of autonomy to them where they could just grab you and crush you in an instant. And so basically, to get these arms to work properly, it just required insane dedication from both Alfred Molina and the puppeteers and everyone else involved in them, as the timings of all of these little movements had to be meticulously planned so that all 17 of them were in sync and they all flowed correctly into one another with no mistakes. And so the way they managed to pull off this nightmare task was by basically starting development on these arms well before the film's script was even remotely finalized, and then taking 2 years to iron out all of these details, down to the tiny little things that you'd never think about, like how Otto's weight should be distributed as he stomps around on these arms, or making sure that these claws were actually strong enough to pick stuff up, or building this weird custom control chair thing here so that one puppeteer could use all 4 of his limbs to control how the head of this tentacle would emote. Basically, in short, the effort here was just immense, and it was a genuinely fantastic achievement by everyone involved that they managed to bring these arms to life so well. And so, beyond just looking really good on screen, the thing that made this blend of a real actor, prop arms, and then final CGI enhancement, which we'll get to in just a second, so powerful is the freedom that it enabled the filmmakers to have, and how that freedom is basically what made the entire story of Spider-Man 2 possible. Because usually, when you do have a highly CGI character, they're really bloody expensive to have on screen, and so often you don't see that much of them, causing things like dialogue scenes and fight scenes to be awkwardly edited around limiting that character's screen time and therefore reducing the amount of VFX work that has to go into them. And a great example of this is how in the Transformers films, the Transformers themselves are actually barely in it, because it's much cheaper to just have Shia LaBeouf run around and be an arsehole to people than it is to have giant robots shooting at each other. But with Otto being this human character who was then enhanced with mostly real props, it meant that the filmmakers basically had no limit on how much they could utilize him throughout this film. And so because of this, the film could actually take its time to craft these extensive dialogue scenes and build this relationship between Otto and all of these other characters, and therefore make his arc so much more effective as we get to see him from all of these different angles and truly flesh out how this charming scientist father figure could so easily be destroyed by something so innocent. And this just adds so many layers to the narrative. Whereas if you compare that to Transformers, what do we really know about any of them? That Optimus Prime is stoic and a psychopath? That's all you really get from like 6 movies worth of his CGI character. And I'm sure they'd love to flesh out their characters and give each of them more screen time, but they just can't do that without the film having some insane budget where they could show them all the time. But now, despite just bigging up how practical and incredible these arms are, still, none of this would have been possible without CGI, because there's CGI all over this and you barely notice, and so it would be very disingenuous of us to not give this side of the character a fair representation as well. And so, typically, for the mid and close-up shots of Otto, the prop arms would tend to be what was used, but for the wider or more complex shots, like a lot of the combat scenes, or where the arms had to spool out from his back, CGI could instead be leveraged as this very effective tool to create these impossible comic book moments. And yeah, sure, there are some shots where it does look a little bit bad, but there were other shots where the practical arms would go off the screen and then curve back in as CGI, and you'd never be able to tell the difference between the two. So how was it that they managed to get these CGI arms to look so good when other 2004 CGI was not so good? Well, this right here is why I made the claim that this film has the perfect blend of both practical effects and CGI. Because what this film did right was use CGI in exactly the right places where it could be used to look as good as it possibly can. But just before we get to that, speaking of supervillains, let's take a look at the real evil of the world, media bias. Because more and more often nowadays, it's algorithms on social media that dictate which news we see in our daily lives. But who's controlling these algorithms? Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, or any other of the billionaires who are just getting richer and richer off controlling what we see and spend our money on? I mean, Jeff Bezos just dethroned Elon Musk as the richest person on Earth again, and not too long before that, a study found that we could see the world's first trillionaire within the next decade. And so if you go to ground.news/CGY, you can see a breakdown of over 240 articles covering this topic, including the study itself, and see which articles are reporting on this, who owns them, and whether these articles have any political bias or a history of being reliable, meaning that you can very quickly determine whether or not what you're reading has some kind of agenda behind it. So for example, we can see that 67% of articles come from highly reliable sources. This one here chooses to highlight how billionaires like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are causing what Oxfam describes as an inequality crisis, whereas this article from the Washington Post, which as you can see is owned by Jeff Bezos, instead decided to describe this as a decade of division. And so if you don't already know, what today's sponsor, Ground News, actually does is gather related articles from around the world on any topic and then make their reporting completely transparent by providing you with all the context you need to help make an informed decision about what you read. And so I genuinely think Ground News is offering a game-changing service that's more and more needed nowadays. And they're actually completely independent and supported by their subscribers to stay as non-partisan and as factual as possible. So by using my link, ground.news/CGY, you can get 30% off their unlimited access Vantage plan for just around $5 a month. And by subscribing, you'll support the development of their new features, like this election page here, which is dedicated to making politics a whole lot easier to understand, especially during an election. So to check this out, please click the link down below or scan the QR code. And thank you for Ground News for sponsoring this video. And now back to the video and back to how they use their CGI in exactly the right places. And so a great example of this is how typically stuff like interactions between a human actor and CGI CGI can usually be really, really hard to get looking right. And so that's often why you see those really weird and amusing behind the scenes videos with the guys in the green costumes. Because what they're trying to do here is fake this whole CGI and reality interaction process. And so you can imagine the messing around that visual effects artists have to go through to get rid of those green guys, add the CGI in there, faking the interaction with them, and then having to line it all back up again to get it looking perfect. It's just a mess to do, and it takes ages, and it often doesn't result in the best looking outcome, and it's just not best for the actors either, because they're having to act against some guy in a green costume and not like a fellow actor who they can build on-screen rapport with. Whereas in Spider-Man 2's case, for all of these interactions, like Otto smoking the cigar with his claws, the real props could be used instead and massively simplify this entire process, which then freed up the visual effects department to go and focus their talents elsewhere where they're much better applied. And so stuff like this is kind of the broad strokes as to how these genuine prop arms help keep the CGI consistently good looking. But these prop arms were so effective and provided so much value that you can even drill deep down into the minutiae of them and still see how they gave the visual effects artists a lot of different opportunities to make their CGI just look.
Hey, what's up? What's up? I just dropped a follow, yeah, I saw. Oh, I heard it. How are you doing? Well, not particularly good, but it's not bad either. What about you? Thanks for another follow. So yeah, what about you? How are you doing today? Thanks for asking. Well, nothing. Nice game, yeah. Not practically good gameplay though, cause how long have you been streaming on Twitch? Well, it's few weeks now. It's few weeks now, yeah. And yes, it's almost every time TF2 or Minecraft, as you can see in my profile picture. So yeah, basically I'm streaming here for a few weeks now. Yeah, you can join if you want to. Play any other games? Well, Minecraft TF2. Maybe someday something different, but not now. Do not have the time to master all of the game, and I'm really trying to get better in TF2 right now. So maybe Counter-Strike one day, maybe Icarus, maybe some other games, but not today. First of all, I have to get good, you know, and actually know that I have an audience that will love to see me struggle there, you know. That's interesting, yeah. Not good, not bad. Just chilling, you know. Having a nice time for a few hours. Ooh. Like to see some of those? Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to drop you the Discord here in well, what do you do for a living? Or are you a student? Do you have a Discord? Yes, I'm going to send it in the chat right now. The mods send it to the chat, so we can copy. I do digital drawings for streamers. Oh,
The control point is being captured.
so you're here to make me an offer, I guess. Am I right?
Alert. The control
Well, I guess this one.
Why do your job?
No. Are you still here?
we have secured.
Maybe not.
Our control point is being captured.
No clue. Well, in that case.
Better and better. For example, for just stuff like a reference perspective alone, they now had hundreds of hours of footage of these real arms moving under the exact same lighting conditions they were going to put their CGI ones under. And so, unlike most films would ever have, the visual effects artists now had something, these arms, that they could perfectly match their animation, reflections, shadows, color grades, and much more of their CGI arms against, which of course helped attain a much better result. Or another example of that.
Hey. Let me share my drawings. Okay. Don't you want to wait till the game ends, so you know. Give me a sec, I'll watch this. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. Let me watch, that's for some Overwatch. Wow. Warhammer anime. Not bad, not bad. That's actually impressive work. To like him. Oh yeah. Well. Well, interesting.
Alert. Alert.
And it will be the price of $1,000 per Dragon.
Alert. Our control point is being captured.
Give me a sec, please. Don't know if you hear me, but hopefully you will. The situation here is fucked.
Our control point is being captured.
What the fuck, bro, my aim? Thanks. So, what do you think about having something like? Well, I would love it, but no budget here. Can you type to the chat, please? Ah. This is our last time. Oh. Crimson Veil. This doesn't look good. Bank. think. Tak.
Please spy check, guys. Please someone spy check. We don't have any fire. We don't have any fire. Switch to fire.
Sure. Good. Good. Hey, I'm here, good. Well, I would love to have some of your Rowan here, but deal is I'm a student that doesn't exactly have much money on me, so yeah, basically I would love to, I cannot afford it. Yeah, so sorry. I don't know what you charge. Well, maybe come here and call me, or I'm going to call you. Are you free, Ra? No? You're free now? Or oh, guys, check those out. Bank. That's something. That's definitely something. Yeah, I completely where you are coming from, but there are very minimal. I would love to work around my client's budget. Okay, I'm going to call you now. Let's talk this through. Chat is not going to listen to it. Don't worry. Well, it doesn't seem like we are going to talk it through. Then I don't know actually if you want to do it or not. Like we absolutely can talk about it, but uh, so you type in, well, well, you have your chance. I have ASD level 2. What the fuck is ASD? What is ASD? Autism spectrum condition. Technical people see others and socialize with them. Hope you understand. I do. But I don't know. How communicate efficient without waste. Cannot describe things. Well, stream has to end. I'm sorry. It's 10 p.m. for me and I have to be woken up in 6 hours, so goodbye.